is our picture of the week. Write a caption for this picture. Wendy forgets to pull up before the ditch. Anyway, with so many things happening in the shop, it's just hard not to be happy. Typhoons are coming. And we're just dancing, thinking of possibilities of future paint jobs, ink line jobs, roundels, camos, you name it. We're dreaming it. Let's get busy. Now on the previous tape, we had just finished the cap strips, the top sheeting, and we were ready to get moving on this project. The first step I want to do is get the rods out. You think this is the easy part. This is a difficult part. One of the things that can happen is, and from time to time, I was building right on a glass table with these glued to the table, and when I went to take the rods out, I had to move half of the furniture in a room and a wall and a door, move the table. So what's nice about this, see, we can move the whole thing. Now that's a big advantage over having this permanently attached. Always make sure you have enough room to pull the rods out. The moment of truth. Now before I go to pull the rods, I'm not going to pull both out, but I want to see if I've dripped any glue down onto the rods. And I just slightly, I mean slightly, don't put a drill on it and just hit the switch. Okay, looks like we've escaped the jaws of death. Test to see that everything is kosher here. We haven't got something glued in position. Okay, so whoa, I just heard something. Do we have to look down? Now I've moved this a half a rib out. I can look down and see which rib oh, there it is. A glob of glue. Let me show this. I know you'll enjoy this. See right out here what we have? Glob of glue right here. Now you sure wouldn't want to pull that through the whole wing. So what I want to do is get in there and just clean that up. You want to go one rib out and see. Now it didn't do any damage. We can glue that right back. But for sure, you wouldn't want to just, like I said, just go spin that and pull on it. I'm sure people that have done this have busted the wing up doing it too. Just go half a rib, that would put any spot that's got glue on it out here. Now you can see the rest of these perfectly clean. Famous last words. Remember, that's the reason, one of the reasons we waxed the rod. Now luckily we only have one bad spot out there, but there's been times I've done this and I've heard I've been able to slide this around, and the front rod is coming out, the back one isn't. So I'm going to go real slow. Again, that little bit of carnauba that's on there is helping to let the rod release. And if you look down, you can see any little spots on here that would be holding us up. It's nice and waxy. If people that borrow things from me and don't give them back, what I do whenever I take a rod out, I run my hand through. Oh, you got a little spot there. There's always little spots. And there's another one right there. But I like to clean it up. And even though this is 302 stainless steel, I like to put another coat of carnauba on it. The reason for that is if the next person who borrows these rods, keep in mind these are kind of like everybody in the club uses them. But what the deal is, if they get a wing stuck, they're going to destroy the rod. It's going to be full of stuff. So if I put the prep into it, it's just cheap insurance. Anyway, the one rod is out. Now the wing stays supported because we still have the support in the middle. And that's one of the nice things about being able to pull out one of the rods this way. And the next thing I want to do, I'm going to just knock this piece loose, break the CA joint, and then I'm going to pull the wing out of the two rods on that side, leaving the back rod in place. alternative way of doing this is you can do it with epoxy. Even SIG 5-minute epoxy. And what will happen is then when you want to break it loose, heat it with a hairdryer and it'll come loose. But this way with CA usually fractures. In this case it's fractured real nice. And it's taken part of that rib off. So I'm going to carefully peel this off and put that rib back in position. Before I go any further, I like to get all the old CA off. It's amazing how people can return things and they're in terrible shape. But hey, that's the name of the game. Some people just don't know. Anyway, we'll clean these up. The nice thing about building off granite or glass is you just get the old CA off. Now usually it'll take a chunk of the granite out with it, but it doesn't really matter in our case because we're not using that part, we're only using out here. I've glued this wingtip to the plate with a drop or two of the glue. I've got in there with a knife, but I just got a great idea. What I should do is, when I do this again, lay a little piece of the sheet Teflon along this side, or even wax this, polish it and wax it, and the glue wouldn't tend to stick like that. See, we try to make these little improvements each time as we go. This little thing is that center support, I have it tack glued. There goes the wing off the table. Okay, obviously nothing's holding it down now. Let me get that support out of there. Okay. Oh, I see what happened. I had the screwdriver popped in the wrong spot. Alright, we'll just scrape. You see what happened? I don't know if you can see that. What happened? I have to get the scraper now. Knock this all down. Get the table back to being clean. I guess we put a little bit too much CA on this. Wow. I don't think you really need that much, but see, it does come right off. That's the beauty of this glass scraper. A beautiful tool. I always look for two things once I get the wing. I have to fix that rib. That rib down there needs a little repair. I have the piece, or even if I had to make the piece. And I look at the back rod for any little imperfections or glue that's dropped down. I found 2 or 3 little drops, but they're very small, so it won't be significant at all. We get to see the wing in full size for the first time. Now once you put this back in the jig, and of course I can just put a bolt here to hold this. The same thing in the tip. So now I have no front rod. And what I have to do is come up with a system. I'm going to make up a block with wood or something to act as, see, this is still flexible, and then I need to trim this leading edge and get in there and check all those center lines. I want to get this jigged up so it's the reverse now. I'm still on center at every station. And this is a pretty time-consuming thing. This is probably going to take an hour or so before I'm happy with it. Next thing is to trim this little balsa lip off the leading edge, because that lets me find my center line a little bit easier. I'll trim this lip, and I still have the little piece on the trailing edge, because I want to get back at my center line, and I want to go off the jig right off and make sure every station is straight before I go into working on this side of the wing. Now what I did, I wonder why I didn't do this in the past. This is the way John Brodak does all his kits. He makes a piece to go right under the spar, and you can see that's what I've done with a piece of scrap wood. But now, I made it just a little bit oversized, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. Because what I can do is move it in and out, and as I move it in and out on the airfoil, it raises and lowers the leading edge. So as soon as I find the exact spot that I'm lined up on, I'll just tack glue that in position. That'll hold my ring in position while I do the rest of the sheeting and belt crank and everything else on it. Again, this is the kind of little simple idea I hadn't done in the past. I've always put a block under here, and I wonder why I didn't do this in the past. But I'll just make it a little bit oversized, and you can see what happens as you move it in and out. It raises and lowers the wing just a little bit. And once I check every one of these stations and they're all equal, and they're all equal in the back, I'll be ready to start doing the work on the ring. It's a great, by the way, John Brodak or George Aldrich or Bull, I don't know who gets the credit for that, but that is the way most of the Brodak kits get built. And it looks like they've outsmarted me here. That works well. Now I wound up using this for a center support, and then of course checking the back. And using the Brodak method in the front here, which looks like it's going to work real well. The next step I want to do is go down, because now I have the ring rejigged and back into everything being level, and run glue seams on every rib, all through the center, into the support. Right now it's very convenient to get in here and get these glue seams. The idea is, before I put the glue seam in there, I leave all the dust in there. The dust helps kick it off and fill any little gaps that are in there. The dust helps act as a filler, especially when it fills up your lungs. And get in here, and everywhere there's a joint, I can just run a glue seam. Now with all the glue seams around all the ribs, that ring is hopefully locked into its perfectly level position. That's what we're going to get done today. Now every night at the end of the night I look at him and I'm wondering when he looks at me, does he think, what is he doing with all that balsa wood? What is he doing with this stuff? Why doesn't he just feed me? It'd be more fun. Peeps, it's time to go to bed. Even you have to go to bed.
Today my brother-in-law gave me some really nice pictures here. If you remember that famous, the shot where everybody remembers the car and nobody remembers the plane, that was in Pampa. Here's the mate to it.
Boy, about this time of year when it's, I mean, we're getting ready for the biggest snowstorm of the year here. Everybody's buying salt at the mall today. Looking out at the pond with the beautiful breezes of summer. It's coming, baby. Typhoons are coming. Anyway, the next step on our wing, we're going to drop the gear blocks in. Now, since we've pre-cut these, and it's a lot easier to cut these before you get to this step, this was a real time saver and an upgrade, getting these things all cut out ahead of time. And of course, we hope when we have the laser cut ribs, this will all be done ahead of time. We can mark this up. Now this was a real upgrade. I really have to admit this worked well. And that's the whole idea, is to try to make each one just a little bit better. Now, the blocks drop right in. I want to make sure we have good wood contact and that I can get my wire. Can move that over just a tad so it's centered. The biggest thing now, I don't want to get any thin CA down in there. Remember, I had each one marked inner to inner, outer to outer. What we're going to do is I'm going to get glue seams all around this. Once I'm satisfied that's just tacked in there. What I do, I just put some CA on a Q-tip and get down underneath here. And when I open up the ribs, I want to make sure these are right securely glued in position. I can just wipe the top of this with whatever CA is left over, just to harden it a bit. Plenty down on the gear block, plenty in here. If there's really one good thing to get off the video, it's this gear block system. This has just been absolutely perfect. One of the things that I always do, right at the end of putting in the gear blocks, is all the wood around them. I soak Q-tips with thin CA and get all around the whole perimeter of the rib where it joins the sheeting, every possible spot. Because the next step is we're going to hollow out the ribs, and I want to have the material around these gear blocks as solid as possible. And the easiest way is just to rub it on with Q-tips, then you don't get the big globs and gloops. And what are gloops? Anyway, now the last thing is I want to check the screws. I take each screw, put a little bit of that special Warren Walker penetrating oil and put it in place, just so I don't want to have a, just in case some of that glue got in there, I don't have a problem later on. Believe me, talk about a cheap insurance policy. Just in case there's some glue on those blind nuts, the penetrating, I guess WD-40, Rizlone, ordinary 3-in-1 oil would be sufficient, but Warren Walker has given me some of this really high-tech penetrating oil. We've had it on the video before. It seems to stay in there, even if you get CA in there, it's not a problem. Always good to check this, because once we seal this up, it'll be really difficult to get in there at the blind nuts if they weren't perfect. Next step here is because I've made some, put pressure on this in various different ways. What I'm going to do is go around, I'll do it off camera, go around the perimeter after every step now. Now I've established that I have the reverse center line on everything, but I just want to go by and check it each time I put some pressure or put some tension into this structure, because now that I have the shells with no pre-formed tension in them, I really want to push this as far as I can and make sure this is going to be the best wing I possibly can make. Okay, the gear block system worked out great. Now the next thing is, if you're using solid lead outs, you need to be able to wiggle a belt crank in here, of course. With flexible lead outs, it's just a little bit easier. But I want to set the belt crank in place as the next real step. But before I do that, I want to spend a few minutes and make sure I have, because I'm not using a front hole, I can take some of this material out. I don't want to take any more than I have to around these holes, but I need to get some more out of this rib. I need to connect these holes, otherwise the lead outs are going to rub on the ribs as they come through the wing. So to get these holes totally opened up, easiest way, of course, is just that little, of course you'll take a couple of grams of weight out too, but the old Dremel tool, and just do one rib at a time, then vacuum out the dust. That's what I found, and that's easier, at least I think it's easier, because you don't have to deal with the lead outs in the wing. And then it's easier just to get the belt crank in, all the holes are already done. With flexible lead outs, you can just kind of snake them back in, but not to ever have that you have a lead out in there and you're running a Dremel tool. Imagine you cut the lead out or whatever, just would make it inconvenient. And again, that's part of this thing that makes this worthwhile is, from the video, you can pick up some of the steps that are involved in it, and it's the steps. Sometimes just the steps of when you do this, when you do that, how do you do that. It isn't really rocket science, but I'll tell you one thing, if you put the gear blocks in after you sheet it, you're in big trouble. Or if you do some of these steps out of sequence, it just makes the work part a lot harder. Now this part here with the front rod out, the ring supported, it should be a very simple, do one rib at a time. And what I did, unless Peeps has eaten all my Dremel tool, yep, see how many Peeps has got? I always like to keep one with a sanding drum, one with a smaller end so I can get in there, especially around the plywood. I want to get those, because if the wire's rubbing on it, it's going to not only be a problem in terms of wear, you'll have that glitch in the control system too. Some of them, the ones that are just balsa wood, it's easier pretty much just using a blade to connect the dots. Some of these we've already got a little pattern of what we want to cut out.
Again, I want to have as much clearance or much ability to move the lead outs front to back. I'd like to have the wood between the two spars intact if possible. I really don't want to, for instance, just make one big hole and then have what amounts to be an I-beam plane. Or in this case, it would be a no-beam plane.
It's important on these holes that they have as round of an edge as possible. That's why I'm doing it with the I'd like to have, I don't want to have a point, I want to have a rounded edge.
And I always like to make a tool just for dressing off the edges. I look around now. See, here's an example. When I was cutting this out, I broke this rib. Look around. I can just hit that with some thin CA. And then the last thing will be to vacuum up all this dust out of the wing. I want to get all this dust out of here, and it sure is enough after sanding this all down.
Before I go on to the next step, which will be putting the belt crank in, the last thing, again, and it's redundant, I go and check all my center lines.
When you have the ribs all thinned out like this is the point at which you're glad you didn't use that punk A-grain rib, because this would be totally flexible now. Because we use C-grain, it's not even close to being the lightest of the C-grain. Those ribs, even though they're hollowed out, are nice and rigid. And the next step is, we have everything hollowed out, everything kind of trued up, everything checked out just fine. Next thing we're going to do is get the control system in here. The first thing I have to do is cut a hole for the push rod, so when I drop it in, I can just hang out. We're also going to have to cut a hole in this back support so that the push rod we want to be able to work it through its full control range. One small advantage of this flexible lead-out belt crank system is you don't have to cut any of the ribs away to get to snap the belt crank in. It just drops right in. You can thread the lead-outs out the wing right up until we get the tips wrapped. This will be very convenient. Not a big thing, but certainly every little plus factor helps. Now what I want to do is, because we have a wide fuselage here, this is a little bit different than the other planes we have. We want to be on mid-throw, and that we are. We want the belt crank in the center of the wing. I don't want it offset one way or another, even though it probably has a minimum of a bad effect. But I do want it straight in every dimension that I can. And then what I'll do is, once I get this temporarily pinned in here, I need to cut the ribs away to give me all the clearance I'm going to need. And then possibly even make some upright braces, because we'll have most of this rib, and this is the rib that's right on the fuselage. Especially the ones on the bottom are going to be holding this as a take-apart airplane. I'd like to have the two ribs right on the outside of the fuselage to be relatively strong. Tack this piece in place. I can still move the belt crank up and down, and to a certain amount I could elongate the hole if it's not straight. First job, see that the rod is straight up and down. Look from the top that it isn't slanted over one way or another. Then the next thing is, now I can just slide it until I think it's in dead center. And I can reference that by seeing if it goes through the holes equally, or reference off the center. And then I can just tack glue this in place right now. A lot of double checks on this system. I can look down, let's see if we can show this. Look down and see the center line of the belt crank is right on the center line of the rib, and that's a good double check. Right on the money. And in this dimension it is too. I'm just going to take enough material away from around this bolt so there's no friction or no interference from that. But that's my double check before I put the final glue in place. Then the last thing will be put thick and thin CA on both sides of this, and that should hold it in place until we get the fuselage, the little braces that go in the fuselage. Double check this with a 90-degree triangle. I can do that at referencing off the trailing edge. Just give myself a little more clearance. So this works good. You need that little hole in the brace. This is always one of the things I've used for a long time. This is motorcycle chain lube. What happens to this? It goes on thin. It goes on in a foam, in fact. And what happens is after about a half an hour or so, the carrier agent dries off, and you have what amounts to be a very thick, long-lasting wheel bearing grease. Now, any planes I've ever lubricated this way pretty much have stood the test of time, that's for sure. And in fact, the usage that I usually force a plane to have against its will, and in a half an hour this will all dry up, you won't even see it. This is a nice free-moving control system. Now the next steps are pretty simple. We're going to put the top shells on. I've hardened up the wood inside here with thin CA and just let it kick off by itself. I want to make sure I have plenty of this grease on here because this is the last time I'll get to grease this. Now seal up the skins. Maybe you can get the sheeting and cap strips on tonight. Again, I've been working in little globs of time, morning and afternoon. But I always try to plan it out to get something that fits into the time window that I have, and I think I can get the shells done tonight. Just by moving that, let's get this out of here. By moving this, that grease will work its way in, and in a half an hour or so, that'll be just perfect. Plus we have the shells already made up, and then there isn't going to be a whole lot of difference between laying these in, and no, there's not much point in replicating this operation. But all of the things we did on the top, including getting the edges this way, everything worked real nice. And this is really a nice way to do it. I really like these molded shells. And the only difference when I do the bottom, so I take some of this alphatic resin, and the reason for doing this is while the rods are still in place, I want to lock each rib in place. This really helps lock everything together. I've already got the other side already locked with CA. And this is one of the few things that's different about doing the bottom. And I'll make sure I get plenty on that wood by the gear blocks. I'm trying to leave a nice bead on top of each rib, so when I tack it down, because I want this locked in place while the wing is still in the jig. Otherwise I could just turn the wing, reverse it, and then do this with CA. But then the wing would be loose for that last little bit of time. A nice straight block of wood is handy for just holding that leading edge down while the CA kicks. And what I'll do is with the green tape stretch each rib back, because again what I'm trying to do is lock this into position. Remember, if you've ever built a wing where when you're all done you look inside and the ribs aren't touching the sheeting, this tape helps pull each one down while that alphatic is starting to kick off. And then the last thing, I'll run that glue seam around the whole wing. I can look from underneath, you can see that I've got a real nice, again I'm looking at it from every angle, a real nice fit on having that sheeting touching the ribs at every location. And that's what boxes it in and builds nice strength and nice integrity. Now, next step obviously the outside. And since we already have the part cut for the center section pieces and cap strips, I'm just looking forward to getting this, trying to rush through this, get this done tonight, because then tomorrow will be a relatively easy day. I'm always impressed how quick this part of it goes. You just get to a certain point and then it's all downhill. And I know here that now I know I'll get this finished tonight. The center sheeting, the cap strips, having those parts all pre-cut is so convenient. Making sure I haven't created any kind of little obstruction in there when I got in and glued inside. And just one other point, maybe I let it slip by, is because we can't get back in here conveniently, I'll get the alphatic on here. I can get some alphatic up by the belt crank mount. See, if you didn't do this, it would be real difficult to get the glue down in here to make sure these ribs are all attached. And these are the ones that really matter, the ones by the fuselage. Before we put the CA, same as the top, getting the tape on so that the tape puts it under a little bit of tension. I didn't have enough time to sand this out. The phone's been ringing off the hook. And tomorrow is supposed to be a giant snowstorm, so I have to be prepared. Owning rental property, this is one of the downsides, is I have to take care of all the snow and shoveling and icing and salting and everything, so I'm not going to try to rush. And there's a good lesson here. The lesson is, when you don't have the time, don't rush through it. I want to do this very, very carefully and meticulously. So we get up this morning, come down, get ready to work, and I see we've got quite a bit of snow, so when it's like this, of course, we can't do any building at all. Well, it turned out to be a lot more snow than we even thought. Luckily, I had plenty of seeds for my birds. And on a morning like this, Karen will usually make some waffles. We'll sit here and feed our birds. Oh my God, there's 3 houses to do. Can you imagine? I'm going to be out there all day.
On the ground, so your phone calls, yeah, you did some good, at least.
Oh, man.
Hackensack, 9 inches of snow there. Seaford coming in.
Hackensack.
Central Park is very close to 7. Now, we've been...
This is the backyard with the fish. Oh, my God. See why I like that picture that shows the pond? That's what the pond looks like in the winter. Oh, look, even the railing has snow on it. I haven't even walked... You know what? This is really going to be a murder thing. And I was so hoping, look at the snow on the windside. I was so hoping that today would be one of the days I'd get to work on the Typhoon, get a lot of work done. But hey, this is the joys of being a landlord. And if you're living in Anaheim or in somewhere where it's nice and sunny and you're wearing your shorts right now and you're thinking, boy, model aviation's a great hobby. You know what? It's a great hobby for us too. Our sure Brodak got buried in this snow too. Well, this afternoon they've declared a snow emergency here. Look at this, it's snowing inside my house. Oh my God, look at the cars outside are buried. Ah, but it's pretty. This is really pretty. We're ready for the second shoveling of the day. For Merry Little Christmas. No.
Wow.
Oh boy. Oh, the joy of living in Anaheim. Look at this.
It looks like it's about 8 inches already.
8. They said it's not going to stop till tonight. I just watched. God, some of these crazy people are out there in the snow already. Woo! But you come into the house after a cold day of shoveling. Karen's got some nice hot food going. The pot of coffee's brewing and the Typhoon is waiting to be worked on. Oh my God, this is going to be a long day. But I guess it's all part of the adventure of life. Oh, snowing.
Unforgettable, never before.
It's just something magical about snow, but boy, it really ruins a whole day of modeling.
Unforgettable, incredible, that someone so unforgettable.
And it looks like it's even coming down worse now than before. Oh.
Unforgettable too.
Now on a cold wintry day, I mean, bananas, waffles, and you know, it'll only be a matter of time and my customers will be here. They usually love waffles on a cold day. The birds love you, Karen. Oh. He is enjoying being out of the snow. You can see where the birds hide. The birds hide out in this bush here, and then they come and steal all the pancake ends. And you realize Peeps has never seen a snow. I'll have to bring him up here later and let him look outside and see if he was an outdoor bird. But if you've never given the birds waffle and pancake scraps, they go wild. They love them. They never get sick of pancakes. And if you don't think these little chickadoolies appreciate having some little extra scraps of food in this cold weather, hey, they like having it in the warm weather. Yeah, who are they fooling? Look at this, the big grackle is in a feeder. He can't even get his rear end in a feeder. Okay, so it's back. We need to go shovel. The shovel and the snowblower are calling. The little birds, he took a whole piece of waffle. What we do, we put the waffles out, the spare waffles. Uh-oh, here comes another one. No, he's nibbling away. He must have found the seeds. But there's waffles out there now. The Grax will take the whole waffle and just run away with it. Oh, he's got it. Look.
Ooh, that's pretty good, he says. Tasty waffle.
So you've always wanted to know what it's like to be Windy. Windy the bird feeder, yeah.
He wants to know where the syrup is.
Yeah, a little light on the syrup this morning, Karen, huh?
Oh, tasty waffles.
I bet the birds are saying, why doesn't he go downstairs and work on his Typhoon for a while? We need more waffles. He can't even pick that one up. It's so big. Sure, you give the outdoor birds waffles, but what about me? What about the Peepster? Does Peepster get waffles? Oh, God almighty. Look at this. We have to watch this because with tenants, we have some elderly tenants too. And I'm going to have to hook back over there later. Oh, jeez. Anyway, I left myself a note because I felt like I'd forget. I'd get all wound up today. Sand cap strips next, you lazy bum. Don't forget. Oh, what a mess. This is why on a day like today, I always keep a picture of some nice warm afternoons out by the pond. But anyway, a little glimpse into the life of Wendy before we get back to the Typhoon. What is it like to be Wendy? Who cares? Sometimes it's easy to be windy, but there's days like today where it isn't any fun at all. But what always helps me get through an ordeal like this is thinking of those warm summer days out on the runway at Muncie. And what a great time meeting all the people we haven't seen all year, shooting the videos, flying. It gets you through a lot of tough times in life. As ironic as it is, and I look at the plane, Don Dixon was going to be here this weekend. Don, you would have moved in. You won't get out of town here for a week, believe me. Anyway, but there's always a bigger picture, there's always a plan that sometimes you don't see in the beginning. And Don was disappointed that he couldn't make it. He's sitting here with his motor in a plane installed, ready to go flying, and we're snowed in. Back to that workshop. Boy, can't wait to get back to working. Back to sanding here at last. Free at last. Anyway, one of the nice little tips, and I think it's something everybody can use, especially if you're snowed in. Well, let me show this up close. What I've been doing, I've been using a smaller sanding block to start with, coming up on a rib where I have the dot to mark the center, and boy, that little dot was worth its weight in gold. And what I've been doing is just, with a small block, sanding until one of those little details that you never really appreciate. Because if you don't get this perfectly flat before you put dope on it, this kind of gives you a bad spot, and then you're right on the edge of the tissue. Now what I'm doing, I'm just going until I get, let me show this up close, till one of the things disappears. You can feel that little rough edge, but with a small sanding block. So you never want to sand this way where you can catch a cap strip. You'd like to always keep the point out. Until once that little black dot disappears, you kind of, well, I've been just noticing that as it disappears, it's right about the time that I'm done and everything's nice and level. Boy, this snow is brutal. The last thing here, and I'm doing each panel individually, being real careful. But just go this way one time and you've got cap strip repair. But this also finds any little spot. In other words, every two can be in alignment, but then they can be a low one. Any I see that aren't dressing off, see, one of the reasons I think that I put a lot of extra time into things like this, because I never know when I'm going to have built my last plane, and then that'll be the one I fly to the end. So I'd like that one to be a nice, maybe I have 10 more left in me, maybe one more, maybe no, maybe this is the last one, I don't know. But I know, let's say for instance, if Miss Ashley were the last one, I'm glad I put all that extra time into it, because I'd like to have that as my friend into my my waning years. I want this as true as can be. Now the other thing that I do is just turn the block a little bit on its side, and it helps dress off the trailing edge, get that even too. All these little steps. In fact, we got to do the gear blocks. See, as I'm doing this, I'm trying to think, well, what's the next step? What's the next step? Well, if you have a video, that's one thing I can always resort to it. When I get into senior citizen moment, I can't remember if I did the gear blocks first or the belt crank. But every time I get done with one of these steps, I try to get rid of this. I try to vacuum the dust up.
definitely a good idea not to breathe any more of this than you have to. Whether you have medical problems or not, there's no point pushing it.
One of the areas I want to be able to run my hand over and not feel any kind of a little bump or edge, because I'm going to spend an incredible amount of time, more time than I'm probably willing to admit, radiusing all these edges off and putting extra coats of clear around those edges. And that's one of the tricks to keeping a wing really light. On this wing, every open bay is radius. Now look, after the wing is, well, this is going on over a year old now. You can see how nice everything, there's no little sharp spots, there's no little buff throughs or anything. And so it's good to have a little inspiration when you're down at this point and you think, oh my God, I'm 100 hours away from having that. Well, yeah, but if you do it right, you have it really forever. And I've been trying to think of my life in terms of, I'm 55 and everything I do now is really for the rest of my life. There's no more, every car I buy, every modification I make to the house is a forever thing. Make this mistake. A lot of people they do this, and what happens, you make every place there's a rib real thin. At this point in time, you really can't change a lot on the shape. But what I do is I try to use either a real soft block or I do it by hand, and I'm very careful. If you start doing this, you're going to pick up all the high spots. So I try to just use a circular motion. And I certainly don't want to make the leading edge any thinner than I have to. I don't want to start making thin spots that are going to be a problem. All this preparation is like building a foundation of a house. Once you have this solid, the rest of the finish goes very quickly. When you're constantly fixing little things or more than you have to, you just realize then that you've wasted your time and you should have done it right. And I've realized that a million times. I should have put more time into the foundation so the three little pigs couldn't blow my house down. Now with the whole top sanded out, the last little thing I want to check, and there's always some little spots that you don't get it nice and true. In this case we got a high spot right here, maybe a 64th of an inch. And I can just make a mental note where the high spot is. Make sure this almost never goes out. But I just want to look if there's any high spot at all. And wherever that may be. Hey, you want to sand for me? Right here, it's a little high. But I can just make little final adjustments. The idea is to do as much of it while it's in the jig as possible. If you're holding this in your lap, you wind up dinging it and putting buttonholes in it, and the bird takes a bite out of it. It seems like it's relatively easy to work on while it's in a jig. And once I get the trailing edge done, I'm real happy with this, and so far this looks like it's going to be just perfect. Famous last words. Everything sounds perfect until you take it out of the jig. Anyway, then I'm going to do the leading edge. The leading edge will be next, and I think that'll be relatively easy because I've already checked that I haven't gotten out of center line on any position here. So hopefully when we take the rods out, this will just be, we'll find out. A lot of tools I can use for my leading edge. They make all these rubber guys. But the first thing, before I do any of this, before I even pick a radius, the first thing I need to do here is get a long block. Because if you start doing this with a short block, you wind up with a wave. And if I have a long, in fact I probably could use the one I've been using to do the trailing edge and the ribs. I want to just and again, the beautiful thing is it's in the jig. You don't have to hold it. It doesn't rub up on your belt buckle or anything. Get across the whole leading edge, and little by little by little, I want to see the same amount of sheeting, the same amount of leading edge, and the same amount of trailing edge.
And then I'm going to make a little gauge to check the whole front as I go so I can pick off high spots out of it.
First thing I can do on a leading edge is just take a couple of cuts. So it's easier to do this because there's just less dust. And that last little bit, though, I definitely want to do with a sanding block. I don't want to go... See, this would be a problem. If you go in here with a short block, or even worse if you use it this way, or even worse if you do it by hand, by using a long block, you definitely can maintain, and then you can pick up the high spots. So I'll make myself up a little jig that I can see. You don't want to have a big fat radius here, skinny, fat, skinny. You'd like to maintain one radius, and that's why when we installed the leading edge, I wanted to make sure that I had a nice straight. Because if this has a wiggle in it, well, the radius will go in and out too. This is one of the things that a lot of people, including myself, of course, you spend all this time and that leading edge is just not as true as it should be. And the trouble is when it's not true, when the light reflects off it. Now you can look at this one. If it's the least little bit out, oh, just looks terrible. Same thing with the leading edge on the tail. Leading edge should have a constant radius and perfectly straight, not waving in and out. You always have a problem is when the plane hits the toothpick, that can be a real pain. But anyway, and toward the edge, I need to do this with a large blade because the plane won't go into the very end. But getting that I can see the same amount on both sides before I actually start with the sanding block. And what's nice, it's being held in the jig. That makes it so easy to do a lot of these chores, a lot of these jobs. Now what I found is real handy. This block worked out to be the best one. And I remember many times trying to do this in my lap and it being really a job. You always wind up with zippers and buttons putting dings in things. This is a very handy way to do it. Now the next thing I have to do, once I get this to a point, I need to make myself a little jig of the leading edge radius so that I get it even on both sides. You wouldn't want to have a 1-inch radius on this and a 7/8 on the other side. This little block, I have sticky back sandpaper on this and that works fairly well. This can help rough out, but you really got to be careful when you use this type of a block that you don't wind up putting 2 grooves in it. But that's a problem that if you're not careful and you're holding it down or up, you'll wind up with a groove. So the first thing I want to do, I have a piece of 150 grit, and this is really rough, wet or dry. I want to do this because I need a block to shape in the corners. I need to make my own sticky back sandpaper. And the wet or dry, believe it or not, is the best of all the silicone carbides that I know. Trouble is it doesn't come sticky back. So you need to improvise. In this case, I'll just, I put a big note on it. I bought this 3M glue. Somebody told me, oh yeah, 90 is more stronger than the other, and it melts foam, so you can't use it for foam, but it works exceptionally well to make sanding blocks. So what I do is I use it just to make sanding blocks. And we could do a whole tape by itself of just making sanding blocks, but as we go from this point in the project on, more and more of the job is going to require having nice little corners and edges. In other words, Bob Martens made these years ago. I've used these for years. They have a cut back edge, a flat edge, 2 90-degree edges. Without the right sanding tools, boy, is it labor intensive. Now, I always give this a minute or so to dry. As soon as I can do this with my finger and pick the sandpaper up, I know it's ready to go. There we go. Takes about a minute. I start off in one corner. You only get to press it down once, like doing a foam wing. And you can make an unlimited amount of... Actually, this sandpaper is a lot cheaper than the sticky back paper, if that's a factor. As if it wasn't a factor. Karen finds out how much I'm spending on sandpaper, she'll cut me off at the pass here. one of the important things, is the sanding block. This is just one of my other sanding blocks, is once you have, and this is all plywood, by the way, kind of get it in here and just radius the edge, get rid of the corner. Radius the edge, get rid of the corner. This is one of those tips if you've not made sanding blocks, and some of our new people, they're picking up a lot of information, but if you leave that edge on the block sharp, so I just dress off all the edges. Now I have what amounts to be a nice sanding block, and this is the feature I need because I need to get in the corner where that last rib is, where the plane hasn't taken out the wood, and this will allow me to do that. And of course I can make any grid I want. I need this block anytime I need the edge, because there's no way I'm going to be able to get in there with the plane. This allows me to get that last couple of inches. And we'll need these when we blend the tips in. Now I need that little block with the little curve so I can just roughly see if I've gone too far or not enough. I can see roughly now I'm real close, but I can see, for instance, if I start putting gouges in it, I want to constantly move this, so there's no chance I'm going to gouge it. I'm going to check to see how good my memory is that I have the same radius. Yeah, it looks like real close. And this, for anybody's reference, is the tool. These come with the Porter Cable tool. It's a 3/8 radius, 9.5 millimeters. Very handy little tools. Okay, with all the leading edge finalized, what I did, I put a real thin coat of CA on a Q-tip and just wiped the leading edge, because that's where it tends to take a ding whenever you're handling it later on in the construction and finishing process. So having that edge of wood hard is a nice little option. Now I have what I think is my nice little way of doing gear blocks, and it's worked perfectly, as you probably have seen on Tsunami videos, as we pulled the gear out and broke the wire without getting the gear out. But the nicest feature of all is the way the hatches come about. Now the first thing I need to do is, of course, put the hatch between the right two ribs. The thing I do is make a little hole down so I can look down. I know roughly it's between these two ribs, but I don't want to take it all out at once. I'd rather just take and open this up until I can see the edges. One little piece at a time till I know exactly where that hatch is going to be. I try to get a piece of motor mount that has some sandpaper glued to both sides. I can get my 90-degree corners and get everything on a nice 90-degree edge. Things I've learned, and it's important if you're going to do wing gear. I guess it's something you can pick up off the video. Since we use an 1/8-inch wire, this length is critical. When I've made this length longer, the plane gets too spongy, and the plane is like on a big mattress. When it's shorter than this, it's too stiff, and I've found that just about a 2-inch arm on 1/8-inch wire is just about right for, well, it's a good compromise between the amount of spring you have, and you certainly don't want to have it dead rigid like it's on a rock, but on the landing it gives just about the right amount of torsion. So I've settled in on having these lengths all kind of standard, that this is a critical thing on an 1/8-inch wire of 2 inches. Now the next thing I want to do, I want to make 64th plywood around the edges. The reason for that, two things. It creates a bridge between the skin, which is soft, and the block itself. I want to make this as rigid and spread the load out over as large an area as possible. Now you can see I have the grain, the primary grain going top to bottom. Now, before I glue it in, this lets me know that I have it at 90 degrees, which is very convenient. Otherwise, you're making a cork in a bottle. Using this to do your edges is just a real nice way to do it. Get an ordinary piece of motor mount. I'm glad I have a little bit of that penetrating oil down in the threads, just in case one micro drop of this gets in the threads. I don't have to rip out a blind nut or re-tap it. Be too critical about this because I'm going to use a Dremel tool to level that off. The only thing that's critical is to try to get everything in at a 90-degree angle. And that makes a real nice, accurate look on the blocks. Now all these should be relatively solid. I've glued all the edges. Now I'll just get in here with a Dremel tool.
I try to get it down to where it's maybe a 64th of an inch sticking out, and then the last little bit I'll do by hand with a sanding block.
Last little bit, and do a great little sanding block. Again, I don't want to make it thin over the ribs, so I'm being real careful. I want to dress off the edges. Then I want to trim that little plate and bolt the plate, that little piece that's going to hold the landing gear right into position. Now, usually that's oversized, so I just trim it down until it drops right in and the holes line up. One right here is stiffened up the sheeting, and that block is suspended in every dimension now. It's not just free floating or like some planes that I've seen where they have these little blocks and they're just glued to 16 sheeting, or those little half ribs and nothing else is holding it in. This way I think this is the best way to do it. And when you're done, it really looks sanitary. It really looks professional. It doesn't have that look like wood screws holding things in and things that I didn't like about other systems that I had tried. The little plate is a little bit oversized now because of the 64th plywood. So what I try to do is sight down the holes and just figure where it's a little bit oversized and trim it. Point in time, after a little bit of grinding, you'll see that'll fit right in there. And I look and I see right here, I'm looking for spots where it's rubbing. Because it's always good if you don't get it exact to get a little bit of a draft angle, so it's like a cork going into a wine bottle. Okay, now we could use a little more. This is the kind of thing, if you make it too tight, what happens, you put a couple of coats of dope or CA on it and all of a sudden you can't get the blocks out. I like to have a nice, this is one of the little final touches I've liked on all the Spitfire models and Strega. These blocks always look very professional. Now, next thing I want to do, I want to get little washers, because the washers get glued right in place. I always like to make sure I haven't gotten any glue down in those blind nuts. Tighten the screws with the blind nuts already in place, with the little washers in place. Now I need to go get some real soft wood and cut a block just a little bit bigger than this. You can always make the piece just a little bit oversized. Put a little bit of a draft angle on it. I'll just do the last little bit until I can drop it right in there. Once I get the next couple of steps, if you do them exactly in sequence, everything will be perfect. And you won't have to do any adjusting. What I do is I get this so I can eyeball it and press it down in place. And it's going to leave the impression of the bolt holes. Now I can look down
and see that I have a little bit of clearance, or I can move it one way or the other. Now, once I have those little impressions in there, now I can take my Dremel bit, and this is easier to do. If you try to do it with a drill, a big chunk comes out. So my suggestion is just do it like this with a little burr. It leaves nicer edges, even though we're not going to use those edges. It just makes for a little bit nicer, neater job. Now again, I want to be able to look right down in there, pick up the impressions of the bolt heads, make a final adjustment if I need it. It looks like I'm close. This side here looks tight. Now, one drop. I just want one drop because this is setting. This is the critical step. Reason I'm not gluing it permanently, I don't want glue getting down by the bolt. I don't want to glue the hatch in place. But this gives me a second or two to move it around. Now, because it's bolted in place, this hatch is now centered just like a picture in a picture frame. Once that kicks, take the bolts out, and then I can put a permanent glue joint on it. Now once it comes out, now you know you have it centered. Now I can just squeeze it the last little bit and get glue around the whole part, around the edges. This way I don't risk gluing it into position. I know you're laughing, but the first time you do that, you'll be saying, oh yeah, Wendy did that. You're right, I did. Now, when you put the piece back, it's permanently glued in place, and the bolts have it perfectly centered. Now, I like to, at this point, tighten the bolts. I know there's no chance now I'm going to glue it in place. Looks like it's perfectly centered, and I just need to find a really sharp blade or a plane, knock some of this down. Now, what I like about this also is that the screw heads don't stick up above the wing, slobbering up the airfoil. Who knows how important that is? I know this looks really nice when it's done. Pretty much Joe Adamusco does them this way. I think he's contributed a lot of the ideas for doing it this way. And the most important thing is we have really built a lot of strength in without adding a lot of weight. You have the last little bit of sanding on this. Again, I'm trying to do the minimum sanding until this is perfectly flush, because I don't want the wood to turn into, microfine wood. So I do want it to be perfectly smooth. And the last little trick is, tip, whatever, is I have a piece of aluminum tubing. I'm going to slice off some pieces. And what the aluminum does, it just gives me an edge while the bolts are in place, because it's a tight fit. This shows me where the bolts should go. Now I can just take the piece out. The bolts actually just centering them. Again, notice that I'm trying to always use something to center the part. Whoops. I want this just to tack it in place. Then what I'll do is I'll take the bolts out and run a real glue seam there. I don't want the glue seam with the bolts there. Otherwise you never get the bolts out. That just held that in place. Now I can put a permanent seam on here. And that gives us nice edges. Look at the glue in my hands. Gives us some real nice edges. Now with the part of the tubing that's sticking up, it's glued in permanently. You know how many times I've tried to tighten the screws on the landing gear and been glad I had that little piece of aluminum there. And when a plane gets 8, 10, 15 years old, it's these little things like this that make it look relatively new.
Now, once this is put in position, the last little thing is just do a final little sanding. And try not to thin out the sheeting. And I'll do the other one off camera. This little step right here is to make, and I always angle that forward because the gear are probably going to be about 15 degrees forward, so just makes for a neater hole, and if we have to elongate that for more or less, we can do that as a final adjustment. But the gear blocks, when they're done, you look at it and it's really a nice thing. It's really one of those things that you look at it and you say, geez, that is a nice way to do it. It's outlined, it's edged in 64 plywood. It's got all the things that would make it last a long time. And remember, all of these things that we're doing, the objective here is to make them last a long time. But it's time to go back out to the snow and again play in the snow over and over and over again.
Every once in a while, this is for Ken Clapton, every once in a while, there's days it's fun being windy. Out on the runway at Muncie, getting all those fifth places, it's a lot of fun. Today it wasn't that much fun. But boy, is it like a winter wonderland out there today. And even despite all this, despite this Dr. Zhivago stunt here, look at this snow, despite all this, we still got some work done on the wing. Even a little bit. That's time management. That's great time management. How come if I'm so smart, how come I'm not rich?
Now, we fought this storm all day. Look at the snow up by the pond. We fought this tooth and nail all day. I know. Look at this. It's like I love this. This is our barbecue. Hello, barbecue. I wanted to show you something. The official count today was 20 inches, but I have a feeling by our house it was a little more. Anyway, typhoons are coming and the snow isn't going to slow us down. Thing is, there's so much snow that I'm going to take tomorrow and work in a shop. Karen's going to take a day off work. So I guess we did break even on this anyway. Birds ate every waffle today, boy. There wasn't a waffle left in that bird feeder. We're in some nice warm weather climate. Trust me, you're ahead of the game. It's cold out here. Can't see it, but I'm monitoring all our fish. It doesn't look like any of the fish have died this year. Oh my God, we lose any fish. That whole pond lights up at night, of course. And I am going to bed, but let me tell you one thing. This is a 4-stroke. It's Sato powered. This is a Sato powered 4-stroke snowblower. And it has got us through the worst storm of the century here. Oh, he doesn't even recognize me with all this hat and coat on. Peeps, you don't know what you're missing not being an outdoor bird. You don't know what you're missing. Now today, before I take the wing out of the jig, all the work is done that I'm going to do in the jig. I wanted to check that I have, then I'll go right down on my laser. Just go down at every, so many ribs and just see how close I am to having this really, really straight. And this is really just a double check. Now you can see one of the things, all this work has paid off. Every station, we're right on the money. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't matter if all of the stations are 1 or 2 or 3, but you want them all exactly the same. And a good way to do this, you can even use the laser to level off the table if you want to push this to even further. But if all of the stations are 0 now, then I would guess that that laser pays for itself in one thing. Now, if it were wrong, and it were wrong by a lot, we still would have a little chance maybe of making a correction. But at this point in time, once we take that rod out, we pretty much have set the wing. The wood cells are set in place, and unless we do something else radical, soak it in water or moisture or something, that's going to be where it is for the life of the plane, I hope. Notice that word hope always comes into it. Now this might be the best wing we've ever made. Of course we're going to find out the hard way. Anyway, the next thing, I'm real confident that we have a nice... I've also tried taking this and just carefully, you have to loosen one side, sliding it up and down a wing to see if there... See, as we've checked it here, it doesn't take into account there might be a dip. There really isn't, though. But if there were, you could hit it with a couple of pieces of sandpaper on a trailing edge, or make the correction, whatever you thought the correction would be. That laser really has paid for itself already just in lining up planes, and in doing a take-apart plane, it's totally invaluable. Now what I want to do next, there's a good trick to pulling this rod out. I leave the aluminum pieces on this, take the bolts out of course, and just put a pad, some kind of rolled up rag here, because the centerpiece will hold it from falling. But the first time I did this, what happened, I turned it, I pulled the rod out, and the wing just went boom. Well, I didn't take into account gravity.
Every time right about now you expect the echo.
Right down here, as I was pulling this out, I can feel and see that I have a little glob of glue here. But I don't want to take a chance this will break a rib. Always good to clean this off. Only takes a second. Actually, you can run your hand on each bit. There's still some there. This is why the rods should always be well waxed. Just makes chopping this off just a little bit easier. Hole under this end just keeps when the rod actually is fully removed. Once we get to the very end, that won't drop on the floor. Little glue things are removed, and the last little bit I can just slide the rod out by hand. I only need to drill to loosen it. Oop, I feel another one. Don't like that sound. There it is, amazing. And before I put these away, we're going to take some of this super fine 3M pad and another coat of carnauba wax, because you can be sure the next person who borrows these is not going to return them waxed. Whomever that, see, there's still a little piece that escaped me. Maintaining the rods is just part of the job of building rod wings. Now you can see I've marked some of the things I want to upgrade on the next run. The biggest one is I want to wax these, and I want to put Teflon sheet, punch 2 holes in it, put a sheet on the side that the ribs run, just to keep the glue from sticking. And I'll save all my supports, so the next person that builds the wing using this jig, and we don't know who that is right now, several people have borrowed it, and almost everybody brings it back without me having to make 100 phone calls. I'll just make it easier for them. Before I put this back out in the garage, the good old scraper, get rid of all little drops of glue. Again, I'm pretty conscious of taking care of this, because number one, so many people have been successful using it, and I hope this Typhoon wing is just going to be one more in a long list of... Whew! When you really put that heavy glue out there, it chews it up. But we've made several successful. I don't know how much more accurate you can build a wing up to this point. I mean, this one here looks like it's the best of the bunch, but we'll see, that's for sure. Anyway, maintaining the equipment, what that'll mean is that, again, the next time anybody uses this, it's ready to go. Now, what I got to do, I have to put this outside, and I want to pad the table. From this point on, I want to have a padded table. I save old blankets all year long, and I had a real nice egg crate, that bed pad. Well, you know what? It's so full of glue I dumped it. And believe me, it's got to really be full of glue before I dump something. The idea is this is one of the most important things I know of. Most people, when they get to this point where the plane is, you don't want to put a ding in it now. And I noticed I did put a ding in it myself. With my big fingernails, not thinking about it. But I just put towel after towel after... These things you can buy at garage sales for almost no money. You can see I have a whole slew of them. Typically you get a bunch of them for 50 cents each. The more you have, the better it is. And then you have a nice soft cushion. You don't chew the plane up every time you turn it or move it. Showing that there's more than one way to do things. Even if I don't have an egg crate, it's not going to keep me from working today. Holes are handy too. Anything you can use to pad a table. You have the concept in mind of a padded table. From this point on, anything we can do to pad it is going to be an advantage. Now when this gets dirty, I just one by one peel off the layers and throw them in the washing machine or dust them out outside. This is the reason I want to make sure I put the Teflon tape. It had busted the outer rib, and I had to put a little chunk, a little patch repair in there. But luckily I have the patterns for all these ribs, so it's no big deal at all just to make up half of one. But this is one of the upgrades I want to be sure to include next time we make a wing, is on the edge of this have some wax paper, Teflon sheet, something like that so the glue doesn't stick to that last rib. Now in today's mail, this is from Elliot Scott. He found this book, and this is, oh man, this is one of the better ones. Got a lot of details in it. And it just so happens that right now I need to get a look at, well, pretty much how we're going to be able to do this, the wing tips. Yeah, they're pretty much rounded symmetrically, almost symmetrically, but in our case, because I'd like to keep this, I don't want to have a 6-inch wingtip. I'm going to just kind of distort that just a little bit. You keep the illusion that it's a totally round wingtip. Now, one thing, this book has given me plenty of food for thought on paint jobs. There are just, I guess, about 25 in this book alone. Every combination of invasion stripes, no invasion stripes, lettering, no lettering. I always do like the invasion stripes, though. We'll have plenty of fun with it. See, like some of the lettering jobs just have very small squadron IDs, and of course it tells you the squadron. Some of them have the squadron up on the nose. Some of them have the large orange, yellow band. Some of them the small band. We're going to have a lot of fun with this, I can tell. This is like, well, similar to the Spitfire, the P-51s. All the planes that have just a myriad of paint job choices, and they're still scaled. Look at this one. If you like ZZ Top, this would be the one to do. Yeah, we have a lot of nice pictures in this, and thanks to Elliot, we'll add this to our Typhoon library. There's a nice part here on even on the Tempest derivatives, the late model ones. Now I just roughed this piece out because to do it scale I'd have a Thunderbird. It'd be more span than I want. I don't want to lose the efficiency out here either. And I'm going to try to keep this, well, within proportion anyway. So I'll get some 1-inch blocks. I need 2 real nice ones for the inner tip, and the 2 on the outer tip I can use this mediocre wood. Now what I'm going to do is, using the lightest block I have, I'm going to make the inner tip first. Probably won't get both of these done in this session, but always the lightest piece of wood I could find in a shop. For the inboard tip, this was a 1-inch block that was 106 grams. That's pretty nice light wood. So this should make a nice inboard tip. Next step, of course, is just tack. I'm going to tack glue these two together. Then go over to the belt sander and dress that edge off, because I want to start with a flat 90-degree edge. The trick to avoid doing this is to put them flat on a flat plate or a glass or whatever. And since I'm just tack gluing them together now, just want a couple of drops of glue on them. Just enough to hold it together while I'm doing the carving. I want to start with a very smooth I see one thing that's happened here that's going to be a little bit of a problem. When I put these on center, this is really not a true 1-inch block. It's about a 7/8 block. So what I'm just going to do is split them apart and put a piece of 1/8 inch, just so I don't have to have the joint on the top. I'd rather have the joint on the center line. If I'm splicing in a piece of 1/8 inch, I'll work off this. Now the middle of the 1/8 inch will be the center line. Again, whenever you order 1-inch blocks, and a lot of these, they aren't really 1-inch blocks. They're like one is about 1/8 of an inch less than the other one. Okay, before I actually tack glue this in place, there's another nice thing about the flexible lead ons. You can leave them right inside the wing. I want to trace this out with a pen. You can see I've got it pinned on center to center. Carefully making sure, whoops, see that moved just a little bit. Keep the center lines on there. And then what I can do is take some of this heavy stuff off without having it attached to the ring. It's just more convenient to do some of that carving off the plane. Now I always like using a pen and leaving the pen line on, because this is not a final carving, this is just a rough out. This is in my bare hand. It's just easier to carve some of this away, some of the rough stuff. Otherwise, I have it tack glued in place and I'm banging the wing back and forth and everything. This just saves a little bit of rough housing. And this is, you know, a great place to break down and put a new blade in the knife. Let's get a line here of roughly where this is going to wind up. Again, I want to leave plenty of material. Just have a rough center line down the center to work with as I start to carve this. I can get these big amounts of material off here relatively quickly. So the idea is that I don't have all this material while this is attached to the wing. This will just save me some of that work. Usually bringing in the front, I want to leave, maybe a 64th of an inch there. I don't want to get too carried away, because I can do the rest of this. While it's mounted to the plane. Nice little ice shavings. It shapes up relatively quickly. Now it's starting to come down to the line. I'm still leaving at least a 1/16th, so I have some meat to work with when I put this back and tack it in place. Comes right off. Halfway mark here, coming down to the halfway mark. Now what I try to do is just replicate the same amount of material, and I can usually do that by feel. And I just got to work the back. I'm trying to leave just that last, maybe a 16th on there, maybe a little bit more. This is almost ready to tack. I have a little high spot here. Almost ready to tack glue in position, and then do the final shaping. But getting that amount of material off is really handy. Nice thing about this, I can just take this blanket, this towel, fold up the corners, take it outside and dump it. Now, with this back tacked in place, the only thing I have to do is the last little bit of carving. I've got the bulk of that already taken off of there. Advantage of using a blanket, now with a little towel, all the carvings again, I just can take that right outside. Just a handy way to keep the shop relatively new. Usually when you're carving something like this, it's just, the chips are going everywhere. It's unbelievable. The final carving, I want to put a piece of tape right along the end of the wing. And when I see I'm getting down near the tape, that's going to be my time to stop. With the last little bit I'll sand off when this is permanently installed. But it gives me just a little more clearance. I won't be going down where later it'll be too thin. Anyway, that's a good little protection against going a little bit too far. Now, no matter how I do this, from this point on, I'm just taking the slightest little ice shavings off of here. No big cuts. Nothing bigger than that because I don't want to get too far. Always a little trick. When I get down to the last little bit here, I call it ice shavings. And it always requires that the knife be held on a 45-degree angle. Needless to say, a brand new blade, because the closer you get to where you want this part to be, and this is time consuming, and I don't try to rush it. And I do the test with my hand. I can feel if there's a high spot right here. I call it ice shavings. 45. If I hold the blade straight, it takes too much of a chunk. If I hold it on about a 45-degree angle and just take little bits, then what happens is I'm never committed to taking out a big chunk. See, every part that I've cut here is an ice shaving, and it just requires a little bit of time. Now, two reasons I try to do this. I try to minimize the amount of sanding, because the sanding puts dust in the air, and that's a problem for Karen. Well, it's a problem for me, too. It's a problem for everybody. So I try to minimize sanding by doing as much of the shaping as I can with ice shavings and a brand new blade. And none of the shavings are thicker than a piece of paper. What's about doing all these ice shavings is when you're done, there's very little sanding to do. Remember, I'm trying to leave the piece maybe a 32nd of an inch oversized, so the last little bit after it's all hollowed out and glued in place permanently, I can take that last little bit off. What's nice about having the tape on there, it gives you that little security. Now this part, when we're done with it, even after we hollow it, we'll be able to remove this last, the thickness of the tape, a couple of thousandths. Now the next step on this, I want to take this off, pop it apart, and hollow it out. Many times when I've done this, I've gotten too much glue in here, and by pulling it apart, it's a mess. So I always try to use the minimum amount of glue. Take this maybe one of those times we have a little bit extra glue in there. Oh no, there we go. Okay. Now, first thing I want to do is dress off all this extra wood. Otherwise, what happens, I'm working off a rough surface. Now, what I try to do is leave at least 1/8 of an inch of wall thickness. Just using my finger as a guide. This gives me a reference line while I'm doing the hollowing. We get so used to making those molded balsa shells you forget how to carve. And I get carvers and I say, wow, this takes a long time. Well, for most people, it always takes a long time. Every part of the plane that you carve and hollow is so much longer than molding it. And now I want to split this apart and try to turn this into 2 clamshells. Now as I was pulling this apart, Karen just came down and told me we have company, so that's going to be an inappropriate quick end to this. Well, I guess we'll pick this up tomorrow. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm just thinking of a way, because I need to make, of course, a lead-out guide, and with a curved tip, it presents kind of a challenge. Well, I think I have an idea of how I can do that. Anyway, by having company tonight, I can think about it a little bit. And I have several choices here. I can make a slider. I can do a Miss Ashley kind of guide, but the problem is as they come around the front, it gets harder and harder to keep the holes straight. So we'll think about it tonight, think about what we want to do as far as the lead-out guide goes, and we'll be back in the morning. Today, the first thing we're going to do is try to remove most of the material with a gouge. Again, the only way you ever get in trouble with a gouge is when you try to take too big of a chunk out at one time. If you take very small pieces, it usually goes almost just as quickly, but you really don't want to take chunks the size of the gouge out. You like to just take smaller amounts. Now, one of the dilemmas we have, because this is a totally new wingtip shape, I want to make a decision. I looked at a couple of different ways of doing the lead-out guide, and all of them have some pluses and minuses, so while I'm hollowing this out, this will be a good time to make a final decision. And what I'll do is I'll make up a little prototype of each one to see which one I like the best. I try to get most of this off with the gouge. In fact, I'll do both of them. Try to get them back down. And the last little bit then with some rough or medium sandpaper. With them both carved, the last step is I'm going to get a fine carbide sanding ball. The sanding ball will take the last little bit out. Way I know to get the last little bit, I put all the stripes in one direction, see how thick it is, feel it with my finger, and get rid of all the little lines in the other direction. Still like it a little thinner, I'll go back to this direction. But always feeling for some high spots. Time you do it, feel for that little spot that's a little bit high. This little guy is usually pretty handy. I'm trying to get a relatively nice finish in here and keep the wall thickness about 1/8 of an inch or a little bit more than 1/8. And again, on these pieces, no matter how you do it, if you put the lines or the scratches in one direction and then go back in the other direction and maybe on a foot, once you get the thickness, then each time, of course you have to have the thickness right, and then you can take the equivalent of skim cuts off each time. Now, once these are finished up, the next thing again is this dilemma of the lead-out guide. This is the area that I need to be able to adjust the lead-outs in, but you can see what's happened is as the lead-outs, in other words, if you just drill holes in here, the lead-outs are going to go like a fan. Well, I made a little jig to drill these. The idea of this was that I traced this piece out, and then I could hold this 90 degrees in the drill press and drill the holes. Well, I wasn't happy with that either, because see what happens as when you get into the front of the curve, and this is what happened when I tried to do this on elliptical wings, they just don't sit right, and that, to me, that doesn't look like what I'll be happy with. So I've kind of, another thing I was unhappy with, I tried to make similar to a Miss Ashley readout guide. Just did a little test to see if I could get all the holes lined up at 90 degrees and I'd be happy with it. It just didn't seem, I don't know, just didn't seem like what I wanted. So what I'm going to do is basically the same thing I did on the Spitfires, and that is make a custom slider. Because a normal, see, the problem is we're in this an unusual shaped wingtip. This is not a normal planes have the straight or the raked back. When it's raked in the front, like a Shark 45, remember the old Shark 45 used to come off on the bottom. So the first thing I need to do is get some idea of just how big I need to make this. This is going to have to be a custom part to make this. I'll make a line slider, and that looks like it's going to be the easiest way to get around this. The first step is to get exactly where we're going to have the readouts exit, and I need to match this up, and then I'm going to cut this piece off. This piece will remove and glue these two pieces on. Then we'll be able to line this with 64th plywood. Okay, this piece is basically scrapped now, and all we need are these little outlines. I just want to tack this in position for the time being. Now with that side tacked on, now I want to tack this side on too. Just a couple of tacks to hold it in position. Line this up. Challenge is to get this little readout guide. Yeah, I can't have it on an angle like that, so I want to make the front a butt joint here, and I'll make a little brace in the back. I want to keep this parallel to the last rib. I don't want to have it on an angle, otherwise it's going to bind on the leadouts. A little challenging with this shape of tip. Laid out a little bit of a support, because what I want to do is bridge this. I want this to attach relatively parallel to the end of the wing. I'm trying to get a nice press fit in here. This will act as a good support. I just have this tack glued in place. Now I want to make sure that I can very conveniently, I'm going to clear on because I'm going to have to line this with 64th plywood, but first I want to make sure I have good access to the full range. Now I can glue this in permanently. Once that's glued in, I want to make sure that that is good and solid. I just want to make sure because I laid this out on a flat table, that I'm not going to put any twist into it when I glue it onto the wingtip. And this, even though this looks like a small challenge, well, you know what? You can't make a Typhoon with square wingtips. I mean, just not. If you're going to go for the Typhoon look, this is one of the penalties, is having these round wingtips. Now I need to line this with 64th plywood. That's the next step. I want to make this as relatively nice and straight as I can. The next step is to lay out a little pattern in 64th plywood so that whatever wear does occur on the wingtip, if we left this balsa wood, this would eventually get all chewed up. That's the reason we want to lay that out in 64th plywood. Also, we won't tend to ding this edge up as the leadouts when you're loading a plane in a car and wiping off. Otherwise, if you don't line this with 64th plywood, this edge takes a real beating. The first thing I need to do is just make a rough pattern, a little bit oversized, and I can use that piece of scrap balsa. This will be a rough pattern, because I want to have a top layer and a bottom layer. I'll let it stick out just a little bit and then dress it off. Let's just say these can be cut from, I want the grain going in this direction if possible, and of course I'm using a piece of scrap. and I'll save the pattern for Elliot to include on the plans. Nice little trick, since we're going to have to get in there with 440 Allen wrenches. One of the things would be appropriate would be let the wrenches themselves just hold it in position while I tack it in a few spots. And when I take the wrenches out after the glue kicks, we should have exactly the right clearance. And then I can just dress it off with a sanding block. And that'll give me that nice hard edge. To get in here and just get a couple of drops of CA on the inside seam too, to harden that wood up, because that wood does take a beating in time. Now usually it doesn't take much to just dress that edge right in. And no matter what kind of lead-out guide you use, although inside it doesn't really matter. In this case we had a customized one, but having these edges nice, I think that just adds a nice professional-looking touch to the model. Always get a little thin CA on here just to harden that edge up. Again, that edge, that'll always take a beating no matter, even just handling the model under normal conditions. The last thing here is I try to look down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to show this on tape. Look down into the belt crank area and see which rib our lead outs are rubbing on, and it turns out it's the last one. So I'm just going to remove this piece of material because the tip actually has enough strength that this is just going along for the ride anyway. But I want to carefully look down and make sure that, because otherwise I lose the range that I can adjust the lead outs in. I can do the same thing with this one and see which one it's rubbing on. Let me show this. Now see, I'm actually pulling on a lead out to the full control deflection. Now see what's happening? Up here, I got plenty of clearance, plenty of clearance, plenty of clearance, plenty of clearance. Okay, but as I move to the end of the range, see it's rubbing on a rib? Now there I have plenty of clearance, but there's a rib that it's rubbing on. So I want to go through and make sure, take that last little bit of wood out just in the middle, because otherwise what happens, I can't adjust the lead outs due to a full range. And because this is kind of an experimental model, semi-experimental, I want to have all those adjustability features built in. Sometimes it's little details like this that when you go to trim the plane, you find out you can't get that last little 1/8 inch of adjustment on the lead outs, or something that isn't going to work in your favor. I mean, it's hard enough to do this when you have all the choices. As I always say, it's hard enough to find a good wife, but if you only had a choice of one or two. Okay, now see, we're rubbing on the last one now. Last two, actually. Somebody that improvised the cardinal and changed the wingtips, and that, of course, wasn't a big deal, except they glued the lead-out guide way in the back of the wing and called me up and asked me, well, you can't trim this plane. The plane, yours, and I said, move the lead-outs all the way forward. They are all the way forward, but all the way forward was here. Well, you see, I want to have this whole range. I'm not fooling around. You look down there and see we've got the maximum amount. I took that whole last rib away, in fact. See the straight shot we have down toward the belt crank? And that's what I want. This is one of those critical steps that I really want to make sure I don't have one side higher than the other. And I want to maintain the center line on here. And I have just a little bit of blending to do on the front. Just the thickness of the tape, I'm oversized back here. I also, this is a good
This will save you a lot of time. Put some tape on the lead outs if you use flex wheels, because what happens as you're sanding, the lead outs kind of work their way back in, and then to go thread them in there, trust me, with my eyesight, I'm lucky I can thread them in with they were 1/8" wire. Anyway, now I'll tack glue this in place before I have it taped on both sides. Check all my alignments, tack glue it, take the tape off, and then run a glue seam and sand it out. The reason I always tack this on, and again I'm going to check it right up to the last minute, is I want to get a nice glue fit. A lot of times you glue it and you turn it over and the other side is the tape moved or something. So this is just my own very conservative way after all this work. Spent quite a bit of time on this tip, but I'm finally satisfied that I've got the best lead out guide possible for this tip shape. And I can imagine that's why Lou McFarlane invented that, where the bottom comes off, and I thought about doing that, and I thought about all the screws and bolts and nuts. And then we go with the old traditional slider. Now once we check this, once I can flip this over, check that all my center lines are right where I want them. Things I always think of is, a lot of times on a project like this, the smallest little detail becomes a relatively big problem. And when I had thought about the tip shape of the Typhoon, I thought, oh boy, I was kind of putting it off into the future, thinking it would go away or something, but as it worked out, I guess it's fine. Checking all my center lines. Now I'm ready to run that seam. Well, many times I've run the seam and said, I moved the 64th of an inch. Oh. I'll bet it happens to everybody. I guess you could narrow the world down into two classes of people. People that admit they have these common mistake problems, and liars. But when it comes to this kind of work, I can't think of anything better than tack gluing parts first, making sure they're straight, and then you can kind of set the odds in your favor that most of the time it'll work out fine. And with all the snow we've had lately, I've been trying to come up with a plan for breaking in at 91 and running a laser. Well, it's going to have to wait another week. We've just watched the news and they said another week of this icy cold weather. Nice choice we have here is with the glue seam is I can run some on the inside and just let it work its way down. You got a drop or two on the leading edge. And so we've gone from having a pattern, and of course this will go on to Elliott Scott, to having a hollowed wingtip that let's hope is going to be as functional as possible. The last step here, totally blend that edge in, do the final sanding around the end. Now, there's always a critical part right up here where you're going from a curve to a straight, and I try to get a real nice transition there. It's sanded nice, then I run the glue seam again and then sand it out again. And once that glue seam is sanded, then that's pretty well done. Purpose this last cap strip serves, and if you notice this spacing here and this is smaller, well, that would look kind of, but I need that last cap strip to build a wing so I can level everything out. But now that I'm done, I can put the radius in here, and I think it gives it a nice finished look.
So we've actually used, I'll just cut that off. We've actually used this last cap strip as a fixture, and now we don't need it, and then all the bays will be equal, and we'll have a nice finished edge here. Always liked the way that looked with a nice little radius in it. Plus that keeps you from getting that wrinkle in the tissue. I always thought this was one of the little details that was well worth the time. I think that just gives it just a nice finished look and gets all the bays equal. And of course, this will pick up any high spots. We also had a real nice blend here toward the leading edge. I spent quite a bit of time getting that blend in. But that's about it for the inner tip. Just a little more time tonight, and one of the things I almost forgot to do, I want to wrap the lead outs because that'll keep them from sliding back into the ring. Now a couple of things, I don't want to make them so short. This is kind of important. They're boink and they're almost there. And if you ever have somebody, if they fray or whatever, if somebody bangs on them or bends them, well, I want to leave myself that even in an emergency I could wrap them one more time. So what I do is mark as far in as this will go. Mark this, leave about 2 inches. Then I know I can go in on this one. And right about there is where I want to mark them. And this is one of the little fine-tuning things. These are aircraft grade crimps. You can buy these real cheese ball-y things that are made out of copper tubing. These are not those. And the one thing, I don't want to make this overly tight either. I want to see if when I'm in the middle here, I go check neutral on the bell crank. And if the lead outs are there and the bell crank is in midway through, then we just need to crimp it. Let's look down in there. You can see the bell crank is exactly in the middle of the throw. The lead outs are even, can be crimped. One thing I can tell you never do is never solder braided wire. You detemper the wire and get rid of this extra straggly piece. And always, if you're going to crimp, use aircraft grade crimps. And I've left enough material there just in case somebody kinks a wire, and you never know when somebody's going to do that. I can get one extra wrap before I have to replace the lead outs. Now I don't have enough room on this video to do the outer tip, but one of the other little details I may as well take care of now is I always want to put a little piece of reinforcing plywood around, and what it does, it takes the load of the bolt and spreads it out over a wider footprint. So what I'll do is make 2 of these, make them out of 1/8 light ply, and just drill a hole right in the center, the size of a penny, say. And what that does, that just gives me a little bit of a footprint. Otherwise, and probably this wouldn't break, but there's no point taking a chance on a model I hope is going to last, well, maybe to the end of my life, or at least a long time. Easier to drill a hole first, make sure we have a pretty tight fit, and then use a template to cut out the reinforcement. An 1/8 light ply is fine, but I want to get the grain, the primary grain, in other words, the grain going with the span of the ring. Now I've just got this tack glue here. I want to trim this, but I don't want to trim it and heat the wire. I want to keep it, so I'm going to trim it just do a little bit at a time until I can get the whole wire to cut. I don't want to turn it real hot, it'll destroy that glue joint. Now the last thing I'll do is just put a little cap of 64th plywood on this, and that's ready. Yeah, see, there's one little extra detail I can take care of at the end of a session when One less thing I have to do on a day when I'm in a production mode. We're at the end of the tape. Thanks for joining us. Hope you'll join us on the next tape. We'll try to finish this wing up and other projects that we're so anxiously awaiting here. We get the horn on, the flaps made. Again, please share the tapes with all your friends. Share them with your enemies too. It's really starting to look like an airplane, and this is the part of, I guess when you do a lot of building, this is the part when it really starts to look like what you had in your mind's eye when you started.
On a moonlight night, you can find them up and along. See them shopping along. Go take your best gal, your real pal. Go down to the levee. I said the levee. Join that shuffling throng. Hear that music and song. It's a big great gate. Waiting on the levee. Waiting for the robber duty. The levee. Waiting for the robber duty. Oh,